The morning fog drifted in from the harbor like a soft gray blanket being drawn across the sleeping town of Bellhaven, and the air carried with it the gentle scent of salt and cedar, the kind of fragrance that seems to wrap itself around a person and whisper that everything, in time, will be all right. The streets were still quiet at this hour, with only the distant call of gulls and the soft lapping of water against the wooden docks to mark the passage of time, and the lampposts along the main avenue still glowed with their warm amber light, not yet extinguished by the rising day. Marcus Holloway stood at the edge of the pier, his hands resting gently in the pockets of his worn canvas jacket, and he breathed in the morning as if it were something precious, something he had traveled a very long way to find. His face was weathered in the way that faces become weathered when they have known both sorrow and joy in equal measure, with lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled, and a certain softness to his expression that spoke of patience cultivated over many years. His clothes were simple and well used, the kind of garments that a person wears when comfort matters more than appearance, and his shoes were scuffed from countless miles of walking, though they were clean and carefully maintained despite their age. He had arrived in Bellhaven late the previous evening, taking a small room at the Seabird Inn, a modest establishment with creaking floorboards and windows that looked out over the water, and he had slept deeply for the first time in many weeks, lulled by the rhythm of the waves and the distant chime of the harbor bells. Now, standing in the gray gold light of early morning, he felt something loosen in his chest, some knot of tension that he had carried with him from the city, and he allowed himself to simply breathe, to simply be present in this gentle moment before the day began. Bellhaven was the kind of town that seemed to exist outside of time, with its cobblestone streets and its painted wooden storefronts, and its small gardens overflowing with roses and lavender. The buildings were old but well loved, their facades speaking of generations of careful tending, and there was a rhythm to the place that felt almost like a heartbeat, slow and steady and reassuring. Marcus had known towns like this before, had grown up in one very similar, and returning to such a place felt like coming home to something he had almost forgotten he had lost. He walked slowly along the waterfront, his footsteps soft against the weathered planks of the boardwalk, and he watched as the fog began to lift and the first golden rays of sunlight broke through the clouds to touch the surface of the water. A fishing boat was making its way back to harbor, its nets full from the night's work, and the fishermen called to one another in low, unhurried voices that carried across the still air like music. Marcus raised a hand in greeting as the boat passed, and one of the fishermen, an older man with a white beard and kind eyes, nodded back with the easy familiarity of coastal people everywhere. The town was beginning to wake now, slowly and gently, like a person rising from a peaceful dream. Lights flickered on in kitchen windows, and the smell of coffee and baking bread began to drift through the streets, mingling with the salt air to create something warm and welcoming. A cat stretched on a sunny doorstep, and somewhere a wind chime sang its soft silver song. Marcus felt his heart expand with a quiet gratitude for this moment, for this place, for the simple beauty of an ordinary morning in an extraordinary world. He had been traveling for several weeks now, moving from town to town along the coast, visiting the restaurants that bore his name, though no one in those restaurants knew who he was or that he was coming. This was something he had done for many years, ever since the Lantern House had grown from a single small diner into a chain of 43 establishments spread across the country. He believed, with a conviction that had never wavered, that the only way to truly understand how his restaurants were serving their communities was to experience them as any other customer would, without fanfare or announcement, without the nervous energy that came when people knew the owner was watching. His appearance made this easy. Marcus had never looked like a wealthy man, had never felt comfortable in expensive suits or polished shoes, and the years had only deepened this preference for simplicity. His gray hair was a little too long, his beard perhaps a little too unruly, and his clothes spoke of thrift shops and practical choices rather than designer labels. When he walked into one of his own restaurants, he was invariably taken for exactly what he appeared to be: a tired traveler, a person of modest means, someone easy to overlook or dismiss. And this, he had learned, told him everything he needed to know about the heart of each establishment. Most of the time, what he found filled him with a quiet joy. He would be seated with warmth, served with care, treated with the same dignity and kindness that he hoped every customer would receive. He would watch his staff move through their work with purpose and compassion, would see them pause to refill a coffee cup without being asked, would hear them speak to every guest as if that guest were the most important person in the room. These moments reminded him why he had built this company, why he had poured his life into creating spaces where people could gather and be nourished and feel, even if just for an hour, that they belonged. But sometimes, and it was rare but it happened, he would encounter something else: a coldness, a judgment, a moment when someone decided that a person's worth could be measured by the condition of their jacket or the wear on their shoes. These moments were painful, not because they wounded his pride, he had long since made peace with his own value, but because they told him that somewhere, somehow, the message he had tried to build his company around had been lost. And when he found such places, he did not react with anger or punishment, but with something gentler, a desire to understand, to heal, to help everyone involved find their way back to the kindness that he believed lived within all people. This was why he had come to Bellhaven. The Lantern House location here was one of the newest in the chain, opened just 8 months ago, and Marcus had wanted to see how it was settling into this small community, how it was becoming part of the fabric of this gentle coastal town. He had heard good things mostly, reports of steady business and satisfied customers, but he had also heard whispers of something else: small concerns that had drifted up through the company's channels, suggestions that perhaps not all was well with the management, that perhaps some customers had felt less than welcome. And so he had come, as he always came, with an open heart and a willingness to listen and learn. The Lantern House stood at the corner of Harbor Street and Lighthouse Way, a handsome building of weathered gray shingles and white trim that had been carefully designed to complement the historic architecture of the town. Large windows looked out over the street, and flower boxes filled with trailing ivy and late-season blooms gave the entrance a welcoming warmth. The sign above the door was painted in the soft gold and deep blue that marked all Lantern House locations, and even from a distance, Marcus could see the warm glow of light within, the promise of comfort and good food. He stood for a moment on the opposite sidewalk, simply watching, letting himself take in the scene with fresh eyes. A young couple emerged from the restaurant, smiling and holding hands, and an elderly woman followed shortly after, moving slowly with the aid of a cane but looking well-fed and content. These were good signs, small observations that warmed his heart and gave him hope that whatever concerns had reached his ears were perhaps minor matters, easily addressed, easily healed. The morning was growing warmer now, the fog having burned away entirely to reveal a sky of the softest blue, and Marcus felt the gentle rumble of hunger in his stomach, a reminder that he had not yet eaten. He crossed the street slowly, his movements unhurried, his mind peaceful, and he pushed open the door to the Lantern House with the same quiet anticipation he always felt when entering one of his restaurants for the first time. The interior was everything he had hoped it would be: warm wooden floors worn smooth by countless footsteps, tables set with simple white cloths and small vases of wildflowers, pendant lights casting pools of golden illumination that made the whole space feel like the inside of a lantern itself. The walls were decorated with old maritime photographs and nautical artifacts, carefully chosen, to honor the town's history without overwhelming it, and the overall effect was one of cozy elegance, of a place that took itself just seriously enough while never forgetting that its primary purpose was comfort. The restaurant was about half full at this hour, with the quiet bustle of a breakfast service that was past its initial rush but not yet winding down. Marcus could hear the gentle clink of silverware against plates, the soft murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of quiet laughter. The kitchen doors swung open periodically to release delicious aromas: fresh coffee, maple syrup, something savory and rich that made his mouth water. He stood just inside the entrance, waiting patiently to be noticed, his hands folded in front of him and a gentle smile on his face. He had learned long ago that these first moments told him a great deal about a restaurant: how quickly guests were acknowledged, how warmly they were greeted, whether the staff seemed genuinely pleased to see them or merely going through the motions of hospitality. The hostess stand was empty for the moment, and Marcus used the time to observe the staff moving through the dining room. There were 3 servers that he could see, 2 young women and an older man, all of them moving with the practiced efficiency of experienced restaurant workers. The older man, gray-haired and slight, was refilling coffee cups with what appeared to be genuine warmth, pausing to exchange a few words with each table he visited. One of the young women was clearing dishes with swift, capable movements, her expression pleasant, if somewhat distracted. The 3rd server stood near the kitchen doors, speaking with someone who appeared to be the manager, a tall, thin man with neatly combed hair and a slightly pinched expression. Marcus watched their interaction with quiet interest, noting the tension in the young woman's shoulders, the way her hands fidgeted with the edge of her apron as she listened to whatever the manager was saying. Her name tag, he could see from this distance, read Delia. After another moment, the young woman, Delia, broke away from the conversation and made her way toward the front of the restaurant. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and features that might have been pretty if they hadn't been drawn tight with stress. Her uniform was neat and her movements were efficient, but there was something in her eyes that spoke of exhaustion, of too many long shifts and not enough rest, of worries that extended far beyond the walls of this restaurant. She reached the hostess stand and looked up, and for a moment she seemed surprised to find someone waiting there, as if she had been so lost in her own thoughts that she had forgotten the world contained other people. Her gaze swept over Marcus quickly, taking in his worn jacket and scuffed shoes, his untrimmed beard and too long hair, and something shifted in her expression. Something subtle but unmistakable. A tightening around the mouth, a slight lifting of the chin, a coolness that had not been there a moment before. "Can I help you?" she asked, and her voice, while not openly rude, carried none of the warmth that Marcus had heard her colleague offer to the guests at other tables. Marcus smiled gently, the same patient smile he offered to everyone. "Good morning. I was hoping to have some breakfast, if you have a table available." Delia's eyes swept the dining room, then returned to him. "We're pretty full right now. It might be a while." Marcus glanced at the room himself. He could see at least 3 empty tables, 2 of them in good locations near the windows where the morning light streamed in. "I don't mind waiting," he said softly. "Or I could sit at one of those tables by the window, if that would be easier." Something flickered in Delia's expression. Annoyance, perhaps, or discomfort at being caught in what might have been a small deception. She looked at him again, more carefully this time, and whatever she saw seemed to confirm some judgment she had already made. "Those tables are reserved," she said, her voice flat. "We have a lot of regulars who expect certain tables to be available for them." "I understand," Marcus said, and his voice remained gentle, without a trace of confrontation. "I'm happy to sit wherever is convenient, perhaps somewhere out of the way." Delia hesitated, and for a moment Marcus thought he saw something else in her eyes, something that might have been shame or uncertainty, a flicker of the person she might be when she wasn't so weighted down by whatever burdens she was carrying. But then the manager appeared at her elbow, the thin man with the pinched expression, and the moment passed. "Is there a problem here?" the manager asked, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone who expected problems and was always prepared to find them. "No problem, Gerald," Delia said quickly. "I was just explaining that we're quite full this morning." Gerald looked at Marcus with the same swift, assessing gaze that Delia had used, and reached the same conclusion. His expression shifted into something that might have been a smile, but felt more like a barrier, a polite wall erected between the restaurant and this shabby visitor. "I'm afraid my staff is right," Gerald said, his voice smooth but without warmth. "We're at capacity this morning, and we do have standards to maintain. Perhaps you might try the diner down the street? The Harbor Cafe? I believe they're more accommodating to all kinds of customers." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Marcus felt them settle around him like a familiar weight. He had heard words like these before, in other places, directed at himself and at others. Words that pretended to be polite while carrying something much colder beneath their surface. He understood what Gerald was really saying, what judgment was being made based on nothing more than the condition of his clothes and the gray in his hair. And yet, standing in the soft morning light of this beautiful restaurant, Marcus did not feel anger. He felt something more like sorrow, a deep and quiet sadness for this young woman with the tired eyes and this anxious manager with his pinched expression, both of them so caught up in their own fears and assumptions that they had forgotten how to see the person standing in front of them. "I appreciate the suggestion," Marcus said softly, and his voice carried no edge, no bitterness, only a gentle understanding that seemed to unsettle both Delia and Gerald more than any harsh words might have. "I think I'll take a walk first. Enjoy this beautiful morning. Perhaps I'll come back a bit later when you're less busy." He turned to go, moving slowly toward the door, and he heard Gerald mutter something to Delia about maintaining the restaurant's image, about being careful who they welcomed during busy periods. The words were meant to be quiet, private, but they carried in the still air of the restaurant, and Marcus heard them clearly, each one settling into his heart like a small, cold stone. Outside, the morning was bright and warm, and the town of Bellhaven spread before him in all its gentle beauty, unchanged by what had just occurred. The harbor sparkled in the sunlight, and the flowers in their window boxes nodded in the soft breeze, and somewhere a church bell began to ring, its tone deep and resonant and full of peace. Marcus stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, simply breathing, simply allowing himself to feel what he was feeling without trying to push it away or transform it into something else. Sadness? Yes, sadness for the Delias and Geralds of the world, who had somehow learned to measure human worth in dollars and appearances. But also hope, the stubborn hope that had sustained him through so many years and so many challenges, the hope that believed in the fundamental goodness of people, even when that goodness was buried deep beneath layers of fear and exhaustion and misunderstanding. He would come back, he decided, not to confront or punish, but to understand, to see if there was a way to help, a way to remind these lost souls of the kindness that he believed lived within them still. But first, he would walk. He would explore this lovely town. He would let the beauty of the morning wash over him and restore his peace. And so Marcus Holloway, founder and owner of 43 Lantern House restaurants, a man whose net worth could have bought this entire block many times over, walked slowly down Harbor Street in his worn canvas jacket and his scuffed shoes, looking for all the world like exactly what Gerald and Delia had assumed him to be. A person of no particular importance, a man with nothing to offer but his gentle presence and his quiet smile. The morning unfolded around him like a gift, and despite everything that had just occurred, Marcus felt his heart begin to fill with a familiar warmth. There was work to be done here, wounds to be healed, but that work could wait. For now, He would simply walk and breathe and trust that in time all would be well. The cobblestones of Harbor Street were worn smooth by generations of footsteps, and Marcus found a certain comfort in walking where so many had walked before him, in adding his own quiet presence to the long history of this gentle town. The shops were beginning to open now, their owners emerging to sweep doorsteps and arrange window displays, and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery on the corner mingled with the salt air to create something that felt like the very essence of home. He paused at a small bookshop with a hand-painted sign that read Tidewater Books, its windows displaying a carefully curated selection of volumes on maritime history and local lore. An elderly woman was arranging a display of seashells and driftwood around the books, and when she looked up and saw Marcus watching, she smiled with genuine warmth and beckoned him inside. "Looking for anything in particular?" she asked, her voice carrying the soft, unhurried cadence of someone who had spent a lifetime by the sea. "Or just browsing on this beautiful morning?" "Just browsing," Marcus said, returning her smile. "And admiring your window. It's lovely." The woman's face lit up with pleasure. "Thank you, dear. I do try to make it welcoming. Books deserve a nice home, don't you think? And customers deserve to feel like they've found something special when they walk through the door." Marcus nodded, feeling something ease in his chest at this simple kindness. This reminder that the world contained far more warmth than coldness, far more welcome than rejection. "I do think that," he said softly. "I think everyone deserves to feel welcome." They talked for a while, this gentle woman whose name was Ruth, and who had run Tidewater Books for nearly 40 years, inheriting it from her mother who had founded it after the war. She told him about the town, about its history and its rhythms, about the way the seasons changed the light on the water, and the way the community gathered in times of joy and sorrow alike. Marcus listened with the attentiveness of someone who understood that every place had its own story, its own soul, and that understanding a place meant understanding the people who called it home. "You're staying in town for a while?" Ruth asked eventually, handing him a cup of tea that she had brewed on a small hot plate behind the counter. The tea was chamomile and honey, warm and soothing, and Marcus accepted it with gratitude. "A few days, perhaps," he said. "I'm visiting, looking around, seeing how things are." Ruth studied him with eyes that were sharper than her gentle demeanor might have suggested. "You have the look of someone who's seen a lot of the world," she said thoughtfully, "and maybe not all of it good, but you also have a kindness about you. That's rare these days, that kind of softness. Most people are so busy being hard that they forget how to be gentle." Marcus sipped his tea and considered her words. "I think most people want to be kind," he said eventually, "but sometimes they get lost. Sometimes they get scared or tired, or they start believing that the world is a place where you have to be hard to survive. And then they forget that the kindness is still there, buried inside them, waiting to be remembered." Ruth nodded slowly. "That's a generous way to look at it, more generous than most people would be." "Generosity costs nothing," Marcus said, "and gains everything. At least, that's what my grandmother used to tell me. She said that every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about, and that kindness is the only weapon that heals instead of wounds." Ruth smiled, and her eyes grew a little misty. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Marcus agreed. "She raised me after my parents passed. She ran a little restaurant in a town not so different from this one. Just a small place, nothing fancy, but she made everyone who came through the door feel like family. She taught me everything I know about hospitality, about making people feel seen and valued and welcome." "Is that what you do then? Work in restaurants?" Marcus smiled at the question, at the lovely simplicity of it. "In a manner of speaking," he said, "I try to help people feel at home in the world." They talked for a while longer, and Marcus purchased a small volume of local poetry that Ruth recommended. A collection by a Bellhaven author who had written about the sea and the changing seasons with a sensitivity that Ruth promised would speak to his soul. When he finally took his leave, Ruth pressed his hand warmly and told him to come back any time, that her door was always open. "That's what doors are for," she said. "Being open. Otherwise, what's the point of having them?" Marcus carried these words with him as he continued his walk through the town, past the small white church with its steeple reaching toward the sky, past the elementary school where children's artwork decorated the windows, past the community garden where volunteers were already tending to the late-season vegetables. At each place, he paused to look, to listen, to feel the pulse of this community that had built something beautiful together over generations of care and attention. He thought about the lantern house and the experience of that morning, and he tried to understand it in the context of this town, this community that seemed so full of warmth and welcome. Gerald and Delia were not evil, he reminded himself. They were not villains in some simple story of good versus bad. They were people, complicated and struggling, carrying burdens that Marcus could not see but could sense in the tension of their shoulders and the tightness around their eyes. Gerald, he had noticed, wore the expression of a man who was afraid of failure perhaps, or afraid of judgment, or afraid that he was not measuring up to some standard that existed only in his own mind. That kind of fear, Marcus knew from long experience, often expressed itself as harshness, as rigidity, as a desperate need to control everything and everyone in an attempt to keep the terrifying chaos of life at bay. It was not kind, this way of being, but it was understandable, and understanding was always the first step toward compassion. And Delia, young Delia with her tired eyes and her tight shoulders, she was carrying something too, some weight that bent her down and made her close herself off from the very people she was supposed to serve. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion, the grinding weariness of too many hours and too little pay. Perhaps it was something more, some trouble at home or some worry about the future that made it hard for her to summon warmth for strangers when she had so little warmth left for herself. Marcus understood these struggles. He had known them himself, long ago, when he was young and poor and working double shifts in restaurants where no one knew his name, where he was just another pair of hands, another body to fill a position. He had known what it was to be so tired that kindness felt like a luxury he could not afford, to be so worried about tomorrow that he could not be present in today. And it was precisely because he understood these struggles that he had built his company the way he had, with living wages and reasonable hours and a culture that valued people over profits. The question, he realized as he walked along the harbor and watched the fishing boats bob gently in the morning swell, was not how to punish Gerald and Delia for their lapse. The question was how to help them remember who they could be, how to create the conditions in which their natural kindness could flourish instead of withering under the weight of fear and exhaustion. He found a bench overlooking the water and sat down, pulling the volume of poetry from his pocket and opening it at random. The poem he found spoke of the sea as a teacher, patient and enduring, shaping the shore not through force but through persistence, through the gentle, constant application of its presence over time. The waves do not argue with the stone, but simply touch and touch again. And in the touching, both are changed. The stone made smooth, the wave made home. Marcus read the words several times, letting them settle into his heart, feeling their truth resonate with something deep inside him. This was how change happened, he believed, not through confrontation, but through presence, not through force, but through the patient, persistent offering of another way. He would return to the lantern house, yes, but he would not return as an owner come to punish. He would return as he had arrived, as a simple traveler, a person of no apparent importance, whose only power was the power of showing up with kindness again and again until kindness became contagious. The morning passed in this way, slow and unhurried, and Marcus felt himself relaxing into the rhythm of the town, letting go of the tension that had tightened his shoulders during the encounter at the restaurant. He ate a late breakfast at a small cafe near the marina, the harbor cafe that Gerald had dismissively recommended, and found it to be a warm, welcoming place with good coffee and a staff who treated him like an honored guest. The irony was not lost on him, but he did not dwell on it. In the afternoon, he returned to his room at the Seabird Inn and rested, letting the sound of the waves and the cry of the gulls lull him into a peaceful drowse. He dreamed of his grandmother's restaurant, of the smell of apple pie and the warmth of the old wood stove, of her voice telling him that every customer was a gift and every meal was an opportunity to share love with the world. When he woke, the light outside had shifted to the golden tones of late afternoon, and Marcus knew that it was time to return to the Lantern House. Not for dinner, that felt too soon, too much pressure for both himself and the staff, but just to walk by, to observe, to begin the slow process of understanding what had gone wrong and how it might be gently, patiently made right. He put on his jacket and his scuffed shoes and walked out into the golden evening, his heart peaceful and his mind clear. Whatever happened next, he would meet it with the same gentle spirit he had carried all day. The waves did not argue with the stone. They simply touched and touched again, and in the touching, both were changed. The evening light painted Bellhaven in shades of amber and rose, transforming the ordinary storefronts into something approaching magic. Long shadows stretched across the cobblestones, and the windows of the shops glowed with warm invitation, each one a small beacon against the gathering dusk. Marcus walked slowly, savoring the beauty of this liminal hour, this threshold between day and night when the world seemed to hold its breath and wait for something wonderful to happen. The Lantern House was busier now than it had been in the morning, with several groups of people gathered near the entrance waiting for tables. Marcus could see through the large windows that the dining room was nearly full, the tables occupied by families and couples and groups of friends, all of them bathed in the restaurant's characteristic golden glow. The scene looked exactly as he had always imagined it, exactly as he had designed it to be. A place of warmth and connection, of shared meals and quiet conversation, of refuge from the coldness of the world outside. He did not try to enter. Instead, he found a bench across the street, partially shaded by a large oak tree whose leaves were just beginning to turn, and he sat down to watch. From this vantage point, he could observe the comings and goings without. Being observed himself, could see the patterns of hospitality as they unfolded without influencing them by his presence. For a while, what he saw gave him hope. The host who was working the evening shift, a young man Marcus hadn't seen that morning, seemed genuinely warm, greeting each party with a smile and leading them to their tables with attentive care. The servers moved through the dining room with purpose and grace, stopping to check on their guests, refilling water glasses, offering recommendations with what appeared to be sincere enthusiasm. The older gentleman Marcus had noticed that morning, the one with the gray hair and the kind manner, was still on duty, and he tended to his tables with the sort of gentle attentiveness that made Marcus's heart swell with quiet pride. But then he noticed Delia. She was working a section near the back of the restaurant, and even from this distance, Marcus could see that something was wrong. Her movements, which had been merely tense that morning, were now almost frantic, as if she were being pursued by something invisible. She dropped a menu while seating a party and fumbled to pick it up, her face flushing with embarrassment. She nearly collided with a busboy carrying a tray of dishes, stepping back at the last moment with a look of barely suppressed panic. And then she stopped. Just stopped. In the middle of the dining room, her hand pressed to her forehead, her eyes closed. For a long moment, she simply stood there, frozen, as if she had forgotten where she was or what she was supposed to be doing. A customer at a nearby table looked up at her with concern, and the older gentleman, the kind one, noticed her distress and began to move toward her. But before he could reach her, Gerald appeared. The manager strode across the dining room with the purposeful gait of someone who has spotted a problem and is determined to eliminate it, and he took Delia's arm with a grip that, even from across the street, Marcus could see was too tight. He steered her toward the back of the restaurant, toward a door that Marcus knew led to the manager's office, and the way Delia's shoulders hunched as she walked told Marcus everything he needed to know about what was happening. He sat on his bench as the evening deepened around him, watching the lights in the restaurant and thinking about what he had seen. There was a story here, he understood now. A story more complicated than simple rudeness or poor hospitality. Something was happening in that restaurant, something that was hurting the people who worked there. And Marcus felt a familiar stirring in his heart, the stirring that always came when he sensed that someone needed help. The door to the lantern house opened, and Delia emerged. She was no longer wearing her server's apron, and her ponytail had come loose, dark hair falling around her face. She walked quickly, almost running, her head down and her arms wrapped around herself as if she were trying to hold herself together. Marcus watched as she turned down a side street and disappeared into the growing darkness, and he felt something in his chest that might have been sadness, or might have been something more like recognition. He stayed on his bench for a while longer, watching the warm light spilling from the restaurant windows, listening to the occasional burst of laughter that drifted across the street. The evening was cool now, with a gentle breeze coming off the harbor, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Marcus thought about his grandmother, about her small restaurant with its welcoming warmth, about all the people she had helped over the years, simply by offering them a place to sit and a meal to eat, and someone to listen when they needed to talk. When he finally rose from his bench, the evening had fully arrived, and the town of Bellhaven had settled into its nighttime quiet. The shops were closed, the streets were mostly empty, and the only sounds were the distant murmur of conversation from the restaurant still serving dinner, and the eternal whisper of the sea against the shore. Marcus walked back to his inn slowly, his mind turning over what he had witnessed, his heart holding all of it with a gentle, patient compassion. Tomorrow, he decided, he would try again. He would return to the lantern house, and he would be kind, and he would keep being kind, and he would trust that somehow, in some way, his presence and his kindness would help to plant the seeds of change. The waves did not argue with the stone. They simply touched and touched again, and in the touching, both were changed. The next morning arrived soft and gray, with a gentle mist that hung over the harbor and turned the distant water into a shimmer of silver and pearl. Marcus woke early, as was his habit, and lay in his narrow bed for a while, listening to the sounds of the town coming to life. The distant cry of gulls, the low rumble of a fishing boat's engine, the soft footsteps of someone walking past his window. He thought about Delia, about the fear he had seen in her eyes, about the way she had stood frozen in the middle of the dining room, as if the weight of everything had suddenly become too much to bear. He thought about Gerald, with his pinched expression and his tight grip, about the way power could become cruelty when wielded by someone who was themselves afraid. And he thought about the restaurant itself, this beautiful space that he had created with such hope and intention, and how it had somehow become a place where fear lived alongside the warm light and the good food. When he finally rose and dressed, Marcus felt a clarity of purpose that he had not felt since arriving in Bellhaven. He would return to the lantern house this morning, yes, and this time he would not simply observe. He would find a way to reach Delia, to understand her story, and perhaps, if the moment was right, to offer her some small measure of kindness that might remind her of the person she could be. The walk to the restaurant was peaceful. the town still wrapped in its morning quiet, and Marcus took his time, pausing to watch a group of children walking to school, their laughter bright against the gray morning. He stopped at Ruth's bookshop and found it not yet open, but he stood for a moment at the window, looking at the display of books and seashells, feeling gratitude for the kindness she had shown him the day before. The lantern house was quieter this morning than it had been the previous day, with only a handful of customers visible through the windows. Marcus pushed open the door and stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of fresh coffee and baking bread, feeling the warmth of the space wrap around him like a welcome. The young man from the previous evening was at the host stand, and he looked up with a genuine smile as Marcus entered. "Good morning. Just one for breakfast?" "Just one," Marcus confirmed, returning the smile. "Thank you." The young man, his name tag read Caleb, led him to a small table near the window, one of the tables that had supposedly been reserved the day before. Marcus settled into his seat and accepted a menu, looking around the restaurant with the keen eye of someone who understood every detail of its design and function. Everything looked as it should. The tables were set correctly, the floors were clean, the lighting was warm and inviting. The few customers who were present seemed comfortable and well served, and the atmosphere was peaceful and pleasant. If Marcus had not witnessed what he had witnessed the day before, he might have thought that everything was fine, that this restaurant was exactly what he had intended it to be. But he had witnessed it, and he knew that beneath this pleasant surface, something was wrong. His server this morning was the older gentleman he had observed the previous days, the one with the gray hair and the kind manner. His name tag identified him as Arthur, and when he approached Marcus's table, his smile was warm and genuine. "Good morning," Arthur said, his voice carrying the gentle rasp of someone who had spent many years talking to people. "Can I start you off with some coffee? Our house blend is particularly good this morning." "That sounds perfect," Marcus said, "and I'm not in any hurry, so please take your time. I'm just enjoying the atmosphere." Arthur's smile deepened, and he nodded with what seemed like approval. "That's the right approach. Too many people rush through their meals these days. They forget that eating should be a pleasure, not just a necessity." He brought the coffee promptly, along with a small pitcher of cream and a bowl of brown sugar, and Marcus noted with pleasure that everything was arranged with care, the way he had always taught his staff to do it. He ordered a simple breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, fresh fruit, and settled back to watch the restaurant as the morning progressed. Delia arrived about 30 minutes after Marcus had been seated. He saw her come in through the back entrance, saw her pause just inside the door to compose herself, saw her take a deep breath before putting on her apron and stepping into the dining room. She looked, if anything, more tired than she had the day before, with dark shadows under her eyes and a pallor to her skin that suggested she had not slept well. She did not notice Marcus at first, occupied as she was with checking in with the manager. Gerald again, his presence looming over the morning like a small, persistent cloud, and beginning her setup for the day. But eventually, as she moved through the dining room, checking on tables and refilling coffee cups, her path brought her near Marcus's window seat, and their eyes met. He saw recognition flicker in her face, followed quickly by something that looked like dread. She hesitated, seemed to consider retreating, but then something shifted in her expression, perhaps professionalism, perhaps simple resignation, and she approached his table. "Good morning," she said, and her voice was carefully neutral, without warmth, but also without the coldness of the previous day. "Is everything all right with your breakfast?" Marcus looked up at her and smiled gently. "Everything is wonderful, thank you. The coffee is excellent." Delia nodded, not quite meeting his eyes. "Can I get you anything else?" "Actually," Marcus said, his voice soft and unhurried, "I was hoping you might have a moment to sit down. I'd like to talk with you if you're willing." The request clearly surprised her. Her eyes widened slightly, and she glanced around the dining room as if looking for an escape route. "I'm working," she said. "I can't just sit down with customers." "Of course," Marcus agreed easily. "I understand completely. Perhaps on your break then? Or after your shift? I promise I won't take much of your time. I noticed yesterday that you seemed to be carrying something heavy, and I thought perhaps it might help to talk about it." Delia stared at him, and Marcus could see the conflict playing across her face. Suspicion warring with something that might have been hope, caution battling with the simple human need to be seen and heard and understood. He did not push, did not press. He simply sat there with his gentle smile and his patient eyes, offering nothing but the possibility of kindness. "Why do you care?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't even know me. And after the way I treated you yesterday," she trailed off, her cheeks flushing with shame. "The way you treated me yesterday told me that something was wrong," Marcus said simply. "Not wrong with you, wrong with something in your life. Happy people don't push others away like that. They don't have to. You were protecting yourself from something, building walls, and that's okay. Walls can be necessary sometimes, but they can also become prisons if we're not careful." Delia's eyes glistened, and she blinked rapidly, as if trying to hold back tears. "I can't talk about this here," she said, her voice strained. "Gerald will... I can't." "Then come to the Seabird Inn after your shift," Marcus said. "Room 7. We can talk there, or we can talk on a walk, or we can not talk at all and just sit quietly. Whatever feels right. But please know that you don't have to carry whatever you're carrying alone. No one should have to carry anything alone." Before Delia could respond, Gerald's voice cut across the dining room. "Delia, table 6 needs attention. Now." She flinched at the sound, her whole body tensing, and Marcus saw the fear flood back into her eyes. "I have to go," she whispered, and she turned and hurried away, leaving Marcus sitting alone with his coffee and his quiet thoughts. He finished his breakfast slowly, watching Delia move through the dining room with her careful, frightened efficiency, watching Gerald hover and criticize and undermine with every word and gesture. He saw the way the other servers avoided Gerald's attention, the way they seemed to shrink when he passed, the way the entire atmosphere of the restaurant shifted and darkened whenever he was present. This, Marcus understood now, was the problem. Not Delia, not her moment of coldness or her hasty judgment. The problem was fear, the fear that Gerald had created and cultivated, the fear that poisoned everything it touched and made kindness feel like a risk too great to take. When he had finished his meal and paid his bill, leaving a generous tip that he knew would go to Arthur, who had served him with such genuine warmth, Marcus walked out into the brightening morning with a sense of purpose that had crystallized into something clear and solid. He would help Delia, yes. But more than that, he would help this restaurant. He would help it remember what it was supposed to be. The waves did not argue with the stone. They simply touched and touched again. And in the touching, both were changed. The afternoon passed slowly, the way afternoons do in small coastal towns when the rhythm of the day is set by the tide and the angle of the sun. Marcus spent the hours exploring parts of Bellhaven he had not yet seen, a small art gallery featuring local painters, a community garden where volunteers were harvesting the last of the summer tomatoes, a quiet park overlooking the harbor where elderly couples sat on benches and watched the boats come and go. Everywhere he went, he found kindness. The gallery owner offered him tea and spent an hour talking about the artists whose work hung on her walls. The volunteers in the garden pressed fresh vegetables into his hands and refused to let him pay for them. The elderly couples nodded and smiled as he passed, and one white-haired gentleman engaged him in a long, pleasant conversation about the history of the harbor and the changes he had witnessed over His many decades in this town. This, Marcus thought as he walked, was what Bellhaven truly was. Not the fear and coldness he had encountered at the Lantern House, but this warmth, this openness, this instinctive human generosity that flourished when people felt safe enough to express it. The problem at the restaurant was not a reflection of the town. It was an aberration, a wound that needed healing. As the afternoon light began to shift toward gold, Marcus returned to the Seabird Inn and settled into the small armchair by the window of his room. He did not know if Delia would come. He had offered an invitation, nothing more, and she was free to accept or refuse as she saw fit. But he hoped she would come. He sensed that she needed to talk, needed to be heard, needed someone to tell her that she was not alone in whatever struggle she was facing. The sun was just touching the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, when there was a soft knock at his door. Marcus rose and opened it to find Delia standing in the hallway, looking smaller and more fragile than she had in the restaurant. She had changed out of her work clothes into jeans and a worn sweater, and her hair was loose around her shoulders, making her look younger than she had with it pulled back in its severe ponytail. "I wasn't sure I would come," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, about carrying things alone." "I'm glad you're here," Marcus said gently. "Would you like to come in, or would you prefer to walk? There's a nice path along the harbor that should be beautiful right now." Delia considered for a moment, then nodded. "A walk. I think I need to move." They left the inn together and made their way to the harbor path, walking in silence for a while as the sunset painted the water in ribbons of gold and rose. The evening was mild, with just enough breeze to carry the salt scent of the sea, and the world felt soft and peaceful around them. "I don't know where to start," Delia said finally, her eyes fixed on the water. "Everything is such a mess. I've made such a mess of everything." "Start wherever feels right," Marcus said. "There's no wrong place to begin. And remember, you don't have to tell me anything you don't want to tell me. This is for you, not for me." She was quiet for another long moment, and then, as if a dam had broken, the words began to pour out. She told him about her mother, who was ill with a condition that required expensive treatments and constant care. She told him about the medical bills that kept arriving like a relentless tide, each one pushing her further toward drowning. She told him about the second job she had been working, the overnight shifts at a convenience store that left her so exhausted she could barely stand, the way she had finally had to give up that job when her body simply could not take anymore. She told him about Gerald, about the way he had seemed kind when she first started at the Lantern House, about how that kindness had gradually revealed itself to be something else entirely. She told him about the constant criticism, the impossible standards, the way he had made her feel that she was never good enough, would never be good enough, no matter how hard she tried. She told him about the fear, the grinding, constant fear, that she would lose this job and then lose everything else, that she would fail her mother, that she would end up on the street with nothing. She told him how that fear had made her hard, had made her push people away, had made her judge others before they could judge her. "That man yesterday morning," she said, her voice breaking, "the one who you were with, I was horrible to him. I looked at his clothes and his shoes, and I decided he wasn't worth my time, that he would probably stiff me on the tip anyway, that serving him would be more trouble than it was worth. I told him we were full when we weren't. I became everything I hate, and I don't know how to stop." They had stopped walking now, standing together at a small overlook where the harbor spread out before them in all its evening beauty. The lights of the town were beginning to come on, reflected in the still water like scattered stars. "The man you refused to serve," Marcus said softly, "is me." Delia turned to look at him, confusion clear on her face. "What do you mean?" "I was alone when I came in yesterday morning. There was no one with me. The man in the worn jacket and the scuffed shoes? That was me. And I want you to know that I don't blame you. I don't hold any anger toward you. I understand why you did what you did. The confusion on Delia's face shifted to something like horror as the realization dawned. "Oh, God," she whispered. You're the one and you still wanted to help me? After I treated you like that?" "Because treating you kindly is not conditional on how you treat me," Marcus said. "Because you are a human being who is struggling, who is in pain, who is doing her best in circumstances that would break most people. And because I have always believed, that kindness is the only thing that can heal this world. Not punishment, not retribution. Kindness." Delia's eyes filled with tears, and this time she did not try to hold them back. They spilled down her cheeks, catching the last light of the sunset, and her whole body seemed to sag with the release of tension she had been carrying. "I don't understand," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Why are you being so kind to me? You don't know me. I was awful to you. Most people would want me fired." Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering how much to reveal. He had not intended to tell her who he really was, had not wanted the power imbalance of ownership to color their conversation. But there was something about this moment, something about the rawness of her honesty, that made him feel that she deserved the same honesty in return. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to know that it doesn't change anything about this conversation. It doesn't change the fact that you are a person who is struggling and who deserves compassion. It doesn't change the fact that I want to help you, not punish you, but I think you should know." He took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill his lungs, and then he spoke the words that he rarely spoke to anyone. "My name is Marcus Holloway. I founded the Lantern House 40 years ago, when I was not much older than you are now. I built it into what it is today, 43 restaurants across the country. And I came to Bellhaven because I had heard that something was wrong here, that the spirit I had tried to build into this company had somehow been lost in this location. I came to find out what had gone wrong and to see if I could help make it right." Delia's face had gone pale in the fading light, and Marcus could see the fear flooding back into her eyes. Fear of losing her job, fear of consequences, fear that this kindness had been a trap all along. "Please," he said quickly, "don't be afraid. I'm not here to fire anyone or punish anyone. That's not who I am. That's not what the Lantern House is supposed to be about. I came here to understand, and now I do. I understand that Gerald has created a culture of fear in this restaurant, a culture that has made it impossible for you and the other staff to be the kind, welcoming people you naturally are. And I want to fix that. I want to help." "How?" Delia whispered. "How can you fix it?" Marcus smiled gently. "I'm not entirely sure yet, but I know it starts with listening. It starts with understanding. It starts with sitting on a bench next to a harbor at sunset and letting someone tell me their story. And then together, we figure out what comes next." They stood together in the gathering dark, the lights of the town reflecting in the water, and something shifted between them, something that felt like the first fragile threads of trust being woven together. Delia was still afraid, still uncertain, but there was something else in her eyes now too, a glimmer of hope, small but real, like the first star appearing in the evening sky. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Marcus said, "we walk, we talk, we figure out how to help your mother, how to lift some of the weight you've been carrying. And tomorrow, we start the work of healing this restaurant. Not through fear or force, but through kindness, through patience, through being the kind of people we want to see in the world." They began to walk again, slowly, following the harbor path as it curved along the water's edge. The night was soft around them, and the sound of the waves was gentle and constant, like a heartbeat, like a lullaby. And in that gentle darkness, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the world, two people who had started as strangers began the slow, sacred work of building something better together. The days that followed were gentle days, unfolding with the unhurried rhythm of the tides. Marcus did not rush. He had learned long ago that real change could not be forced, that it had to grow naturally, like a garden, with patience and care and the right conditions. And so, he moved through Bellhaven softly, speaking quietly with the people who worked at the lantern house, listening to their stories, understanding the landscape of fear that Gerald had created and the way it had shaped everything that happened within those warm, glowing walls. He met Arthur, the kind older server, and learned that Arthur had once managed a restaurant of his own, had retired to Bellhaven to be near his grandchildren, and had taken the job at the Lantern House because he loved the work and wanted to stay connected to the rhythm of hospitality. Arthur told him about watching Gerald chip away at the staff's confidence, about wanting to speak up but not knowing how, about feeling powerless to change things from his position as a server. He met Caleb, the young host, and learned that Caleb was putting himself through college and needed the flexible hours that the Lantern House provided. Caleb told him about the dreams he had for the future, about the way Gerald's criticism made him doubt those dreams, about how he had started to believe that maybe he wasn't smart enough or talented enough to achieve what he wanted. He met the line cooks and the dishwashers, the bussers and the bartenders, and each of them had a story to tell, a story of pressures and fear, of small cruelties that added up over time, of a workplace that had become something to endure rather than enjoy. And Marcus listened to all of them with the same gentle attention, the same patient kindness, the same absolute conviction that things could be different. He learned about Gerald too, though Gerald himself was not part of these conversations. He learned that Gerald had come to the Lantern House from a corporate chain restaurant where the management style was harsh and demanding, where success was measured in numbers alone and human connection was considered a waste of time. He learned that Gerald had never been taught another way, had never seen what hospitality could look like when it was rooted in kindness rather than fear. He learned that beneath Gerald's pinched expression and his tight grip was a man who was himself afraid of failure, afraid of not measuring up, afraid that if he showed any softness, he would be seen as weak. This did not excuse what Gerald had done. Marcus understood that. Creating a culture of fear, however unconsciously, caused real harm to real people. And that harm could not simply be waved away by understanding its origins. But it did help Marcus see that Gerald was not a villain, not an enemy to be defeated, but a person who had lost his way and needed help finding it again. The question was how to offer that help in a way that Gerald could receive. It was Delia who suggested the answer. They had been meeting each evening, walking along the harbor as the sun set, talking about everything and nothing. Marcus had arranged for her mother to be seen by a specialist in the city, had quietly ensured that the medical bills would be taken care of through a foundation that the Lantern House supported. He had not told Delia about this directly. He had simply made sure it happened, and when she had called him in tears to tell him that a hospital assistance program had covered her mother's treatment costs, he had listened and celebrated with her without ever claiming credit. With that weight lifted, Delia had begun to change. The tension in her shoulders had eased. The fear in her eyes had dimmed. She smiled more easily, laughed more readily, and her interactions with customers had transformed into something warm and genuine. Marcus saw her one afternoon stopping to help an elderly customer with his coat, and the tenderness in her movements brought tears to his eyes. "Gerald is afraid," Delia said one evening as they walked. "I can see it now, in a way I couldn't see before. He's terrified of being seen as a failure. And so he pushes all that terror onto us, tries to make us carry it instead. But that doesn't work. It just spreads the fear around. It doesn't make it go away. No, Marcus agreed. Fear doesn't work that way. The only thing that dissolves fear is love, or safety, or both. Delia was quiet for a moment, watching the water. What if we showed him? She said finally. What if we showed him that there's another way? Not by confronting him or criticizing him, but by just being different. Being the kind of restaurant we want to work at, regardless of what he does. What if we just started treating each other with kindness, treating the customers with warmth, and let him see what that looks like? Marcus smiled. You sound like my grandmother. I'll take that as a compliment. It's the highest compliment I can give. And so they began, not with announcements or proclamations, not with meetings or memos, but simply with small acts of kindness that rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. Delia started leaving notes of encouragement for her co-workers in the break room. Simple messages like, "You handled that difficult table beautifully," or "Your smile makes a difference to people." Arthur began mentioning to Gerald when things went well, not in a sycophantic way, but simply acknowledging the truth. The dining room looks beautiful tonight. Or, the kitchen really delivered on that special order. Caleb started a tradition of bringing in homemade cookies on Sunday mornings, sharing them with everyone, including Gerald. The line cooks began to take extra care with presentation, not because they were afraid of criticism, but because they wanted to create something beautiful. The dishwashers started playing quiet music in the kitchen during their shifts, and soon people were humming along as they worked. Marcus watched all of this unfold from his usual table by the window, where he had become something of a fixture. The staff knew who he was now. He had asked Delia to share the truth, feeling that honesty was important, but he had made it clear that he was not there to judge or evaluate, only to support. Think of me as a friend, he had told them, who happens to know a lot about restaurants. And gradually, something began to shift in the atmosphere of the Lantern House. The fear did not disappear overnight. It had grown too deep for that. But it began to thin, to lighten, like fog burning off in the morning sun. People stood a little straighter, smiled a little more easily, treated each other with a little more gentleness. Gerald noticed, of course. It was impossible not to notice. And at first, his response was suspicion. He watched the staff with narrowed eyes, waiting for the other shoe to drop, certain that this apparent transformation was somehow a trick or a rebellion in disguise. But nothing bad happened. The numbers were good. Better than good, actually. Customer satisfaction was up. Employee turnover, which had been high under Gerald's management, slowed to nearly nothing. The restaurant was thriving. Marcus chose his moment carefully. It was a Tuesday afternoon, slow and quiet, with only a handful of customers scattered through the dining room. Gerald was at his usual post near the kitchen doors, clipboard in hand, reviewing the previous day's receipts with his habitual frown. "Gerald," Marcus said, approaching him with the same gentle manner he approached everyone. "I wonder if you might have a few minutes to talk. I've been meaning to get to know you better." Gerald looked up, his expression guarded. He knew who Marcus was now. The staff's change in demeanor had told him that much, and he had been waiting for the confrontation he was certain was coming. "Of course, Mr. Holloway, we can use my office." "Actually," Marcus said, "I was thinking we might take a walk instead. It's such a beautiful afternoon, and I find that I think better when I'm moving." They walked along the harbor path, the same path Marcus had walked so many times with Delia, and for a long while neither of them spoke. Gerald was tense, his shoulders rigid, his jaw tight, preparing himself for accusations and recriminations. But Marcus did not accuse. He did not recriminate. Instead, he told a story. "When I was 23 years old," he said, his voice soft and unhurried, "I worked for a man named Victor Crane. He owned a chain of diners in the Midwest, and I was the assistant manager at one of his locations. Victor was difficult. He believed that fear was the only way to motivate people, that if you weren't hard on your employees, they would take advantage of you. He yelled. He threatened. He made everyone around him miserable. Gerald said nothing, but Marcus could see him listening intently. I tried to be like Victor, Marcus continued. I thought that was what successful management looked like. I was harsh with my staff, demanding with my cooks, cold with my customers, and for a while, it seemed to work. The numbers were good. The restaurant was efficient. But I was miserable, and so was everyone around me. They had reached the overlook where Marcus and Delia had stood that first evening, and Marcus stopped to look out at the water. The afternoon light was golden and soft, painting everything in shades of honey and amber. One day, he said, a customer came in, an old woman, probably in her 80s. She was poorly dressed, clearly not wealthy, and she moved slowly because of her arthritis. She sat at the counter and ordered a cup of coffee, just a cup of coffee, and she sat there for 2 hours nursing it while she wrote in a small notebook. Marcus paused, remembering. Victor would have wanted her gone. She wasn't spending enough money, wasn't turning over the seat fast enough. I went over to hint that maybe it was time for her to leave, and she looked up at me with the kindest eyes I had ever seen, and she said, "Young man, this is the first time I've felt warm in 3 days. My heat was turned off, you see. I know I should buy more than just coffee, but this is all I can afford. I'm sorry if I'm in the way." Gerald was very still now, his breath soft in the quiet afternoon. "I didn't kick her out," Marcus said. "I brought her a sandwich on the house, and I sat with her while she ate it. She told me about her life, about the husband she had lost, about the children who had moved away and forgotten her. And when she left, she pressed something into my hand. A coin. An old coin that had been her husband's, the only valuable thing she had left. She wanted to give it to me because I had been kind." Marcus turned to look at Gerald, and his eyes were gentle and full of understanding. "I tried to give it back, but she wouldn't take it. She said, 'Kindness is worth more than money. This is me paying what you're owed.' And I realized in that moment that everything Victor had taught me was wrong. Fear doesn't create success. Fear creates suffering. And there is another way, a better way, to lead." Gerald's jaw worked, and Marcus could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes. The walls he had built were high and thick, but there were cracks in them now, places where the light was beginning to seep through. "I'm not telling you this to lecture you," Marcus said. "I'm telling you because I see myself in you. The self I used to be. The self I'm grateful I stopped being. And I want you to know that it's not too late. It's never too late to choose kindness, to choose a different way." They stood in silence for a long moment, the water glittering before them, the town of Bellhaven spread out in all its gentle beauty. And then Gerald spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know how," he said. "I don't know how to be any other way. This is all I've ever known." "Then let us show you," Marcus said simply. "Let Delia and Arthur and the rest of the staff show you. Let me show you. You don't have to figure it out alone. No one should have to figure anything out alone." Gerald's chin trembled, and for a moment Marcus thought he might cry. But he steadied himself, drew a long breath, and nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, I'll try." And there, in the golden afternoon light, with the sound of the water and the cry of the gulls as witnesses, something began to heal. Not all at once, not completely. Healing never happens that way. But a first step was taken, a door was opened, and that was enough to begin. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet transformation. Gerald did not change overnight. No one does. But he began to change. He began to notice when things went well and to mention it. He began to ask questions instead of giving orders. He began to sit with the staff during slow periods, not to criticize, but simply to talk, to learn about their lives, to understand them as people, rather than as problems to be managed. There were setbacks, of course. Old habits do not die easily, and fear has deep roots that take time to dig up. There were days when Gerald reverted to his old ways, when his voice grew sharp and his grip grew tight. But now, instead of shrinking away, the staff responded with patience and kindness, gently reminding him of the new path he was trying to walk. And Gerald, to his credit, listened. He apologized. He tried again. Delia flourished in this new environment like a flower finally receiving the sunlight it had always needed. She became a leader among the staff, not because she sought power, but because she led by example, showing every day what kindness in action looked like. Her interactions with customers became legendary in Bellhaven. People came to the Lantern House specifically to be served by her, to experience the warmth and care she offered so freely. Arthur became something of a mentor to Gerald, sharing the wisdom he had accumulated over his many years in the industry. He taught Gerald about the difference between fear and respect, about the way that kindness created loyalty, while harshness created only resentment. And Gerald, humbled and hungry to learn, absorbed these lessons like dry earth absorbing rain. The restaurant itself was transformed in ways that went beyond atmosphere. Marcus worked with the regional management to implement the policies he had always intended the Lantern House to embody: living wages for all staff, comprehensive benefits, flexible scheduling that allowed people to attend to the rest of their lives. He established a hardship fund that employees could access when unexpected difficulties arose, and he created a mentorship program that would ensure future managers were trained in a philosophy of kindness from the very beginning. And through it all, he walked. Every morning and every evening, Marcus walked the harbor path, sometimes alone and sometimes with Delia or Arthur or even Gerald, watching the light change on the water and feeling grateful for this town, this community, this unexpected chapter in his life. One morning, about 6 weeks after his arrival, Marcus sat at his usual table by the window and realized that he was ready to move on. The Lantern House in Bellhaven was healed, or at least well on its way to healing. The people he had come to care about were thriving. The spirit of kindness that he had always wanted this company to embody was alive and well in this beautiful town by the sea. He called Delia over and told her that he would be leaving the next day. She looked at him with eyes that shimmered with emotion, but she did not try to convince him to stay. She understood, as he knew she would, that his work here was complete. "Will you come back?" she asked. "I will," he promised. "Not to check up on you. I trust you completely. But because I love this town, and I love this restaurant, and I've made friends here that I want to see again." Delia smiled, that warm, genuine smile that had transformed along with everything else. "We'll be ready for you," she said. "We'll be the restaurant you always wanted us to be." "You already are," Marcus said. "You always were. You just needed help remembering." That evening, the entire staff of the Lantern House gathered in the dining room after closing to say goodbye. They had arranged a small celebration, nothing fancy, just good food and warm conversation and the kind of connection that can only grow from shared struggle and shared triumph. Arthur had prepared his famous crab cakes, the ones he made for special occasions. Caleb had baked a cake that read "Thank you, Marcus" in slightly uneven frosting. And Gerald, in a moment that surprised everyone including himself, gave a small speech. "I've been managing restaurants for 15 years, he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I thought I knew how to do it. I thought I knew what leadership looked like. But I didn't. I was wrong. And this man?" He gestured to Marcus, who sat in his usual spot by the window. "This man showed me a different way. Not by yelling at me or firing me or telling me what a terrible person I was, but by being kind, by being patient, by believing that I could be better, even when I didn't believe it myself. He turned to face Marcus directly, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Marcus rose and crossed the room to embrace Gerald, and the room erupted in applause. It was a moment of grace, of healing, of redemption. The kind of moment that Marcus had spent his entire life trying to create, one small kindness at a time. The morning of Marcus's departure was soft and gray, like the morning of his arrival, with a gentle mist rising from the harbor and the air carrying the scent of salt and possibility. He stood at the end of the pier, his simple canvas bag slung over his shoulder, watching the fishing boats head out for their morning work and feeling something settle into place in his heart. Delia found him there, as he had known she would. She had insisted on walking him to the bus station, though he had told her it wasn't necessary. Some things, she had said, were necessary whether you needed them or not. "I've been thinking," she said, falling into step beside him as they began to walk, "about what you said, about kindness being the only thing that can heal the world. And what have you been thinking about it?" "I've been thinking that it's true," she said, "but it's also hard. It's so much easier to be afraid, to protect yourself, to judge people before they can judge you. Kindness takes courage." "It does," Marcus agreed. "It's the bravest thing a person can do, to keep their heart open in a world that gives so many reasons to close it." They walked in silence for a while, past the shops that were just beginning to open, past Ruth's bookstore, where the morning light caught the display of seashells in the window, past the little church with its steeple reaching toward the softening sky. "Will you write to me?" Delia asked as they reached the bus station. "I will," Marcus promised. "And you'll write to me and tell me how things are going. Tell me about your mother. Tell me about the restaurant. Tell me about Bellhaven in the spring, when the flowers bloom and the tourists come." The bus arrived, silver and gleaming in the morning light, and Marcus embraced Delia one last time. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." "Thank you," he replied, "for being brave enough to let me help." He climbed aboard the bus and found a seat by the window, where he could watch Bellhaven grow smaller as the bus pulled away. He saw Delia standing on the platform, her hand raised in farewell, and he raised his own hand in return, holding the gesture until she was out of sight. The bus wound through the coastal hills, carrying Marcus away from the town that had become so precious to him, toward whatever came next. He did not know where that would be. There were always more restaurants to visit, more people to meet, more chances to plant the seeds of kindness in soil that needed it. But for now, he was content to sit in the gentle rocking of the bus and let his mind drift toward peaceful things. He thought of his grandmother, of her small restaurant and her enormous heart, of the way she had taught him that every person who walked through the door was a gift. He thought of the old woman with the coin, the one who had changed his life by accepting his kindness and offering her own in return. He thought of Delia and Gerald and Arthur, and all the people of Bellhaven who had reminded him why he did this work, why he had built this company, why he got up every morning and kept trying to make the world a little gentler. The mist was burning off now, revealing patches of blue sky, and the sun was warm through the window of the bus. Marcus closed his eyes and let himself rest, trusting that the road would carry him where he needed to go. Behind him, in the small coastal town of Bellhaven, a restaurant called the Lantern House was opening its doors for another day. The staff were gathering in the kitchen, sharing stories and laughter, preparing to welcome whoever might come through the door. There was no fear in that place anymore, only warmth, only kindness, only the simple, radical commitment to treating every person as worthy of welcome and care. And somewhere in the dining room, a single lamp burned steadily, casting its gentle glow over the tables and the flowers and the faces of the people gathered there. A light in the world, steady and true, guiding everyone who saw it towards something that felt like home. The bus carried Marcus through rolling hills and quiet valleys, past farmland and forests, and small towns that flickered by the window like postcards from another era. He dozed for a while, his head resting against the cool glass, and his dreams were gentle. Visions of his grandmother's kitchen, of morning light on harbor water, of the sound of Delia's laughter echoing across a crowded dining room. When he woke, the landscape had changed. They were climbing now, moving into country where the trees grew tall and the air carried the green scent of pine and cedar. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still dusted with snow despite the lateness of the season, and the sky above them was the clear, deep blue that comes only at high altitudes. Marcus had not planned to stop here, in this mountain town whose name he did not yet know. But when the bus pulled into a small station and the driver announced a 30-minute rest stop, something stirred in his heart, a whisper of intuition, a gentle pull that he had learned long ago to trust. He gathered his bag and stepped off the bus, breathing in the cool, clean air and looking around at the town that had appeared before him like a gift. It was a different kind of place than Bellhaven, mountain instead of coastal, pine instead of salt, but it had the same feeling of gentle community, the same sense of a place where people looked after one another and welcomed strangers with open hearts. The main street was lined with small shops, their windows bright with autumn displays, and there was a park in the center of town where families had gathered to enjoy the afternoon sunshine. And there, on the corner of Main and Maple, stood another lantern house. Marcus smiled to himself, feeling the familiar mix of curiosity and hope that always came when he encountered one of his restaurants in the wild. He did not know what he would find inside, perhaps warmth and welcome, perhaps something else that needed healing. Either way, he would meet it with the Ewing's same gentle spirit he had carried with him his whole life. But not today. Today, he was tired, and the mountain air was making him drowsy, and the bus would be leaving soon to carry him onward to wherever he was meant to go. Today, he would simply note the location of this lantern house, tuck it away in his memory for a future visit, and trust that whatever was happening inside those walls would reveal itself in its own time. He bought a cup of coffee from a small cart near the bus station, warming his hands on the cup as he watched the town go about its business. A young mother pushed a stroller past him, humming a quiet lullaby to the baby inside. An elderly man sat on a bench reading a newspaper, looking up to nod companionably at everyone who passed. Two teenagers walked by with their arms around each other, lost in the private world of young love. The world, Marcus thought, was full of such moments, full of small kindnesses and quiet connections, full of people trying their best to navigate lives that were often hard but also often beautiful. It was easy to focus on the difficulties, on the Geralds and the fears, and the wounds that needed healing. But it was equally true that the world was overflowing with goodness, with generosity, with the fundamental human desire to love and be loved. His grandmother had taught him to look for this goodness. She had taught him that it was everywhere, if only you had eyes to see it. And over the years, he had trained those eyes, honed them like a craftsman hones his tools, until he could find the light even in the darkest places. The bus driver called for passengers to reboard, and Marcus took one last look at the mountain town with its small shops and its warm light and its lantern house waiting to be visited. He would come back, he decided, not next week or next month, but sometime, when the moment was right, when his feet carried him back to this place. He climbed onto the bus and settled into his seat, the coffee warming his hands and the memory of Bellhaven warming his heart. The engine rumbled to life, and the bus pulled away from the station, continuing its journey through the mountains toward whatever came next. Outside the window, the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The mountains caught the light and glowed, and the trees stood tall and still, and the world felt peaceful and full of possibility. Marcus let his eyes close again, let the rocking of the bus lull him toward sleep. In his mind, he saw Delia's smile and Arthur's kind eyes and Gerald's trembling chin. He saw Ruth in her bookshop surrounded by stories. He saw the harbor at sunset, the water catching the last light like scattered gold. And he felt, as he often felt in these quiet moments, an overwhelming gratitude for this life he had been given, this life of walking the world gently, planting seeds of kindness wherever he went, trusting that those seeds would grow in their own time, in their own way. The waves did not argue with the stone. They simply touched and touched again, and in the touching, both were changed. Night fell softly over the mountains, and the bus continued its journey through the darkness, its headlights cutting twin paths of light through the quiet world. Inside, the passengers settled into sleep, their heads resting against windows or companions' shoulders, their breathing slow and regular in the gentle hum of the engine. Marcus was awake, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. They seemed closer here, in the mountains, brighter and more numerous than they appeared in the valleys below. He thought about how many people had looked at these same stars over the millennia, how many dreams had been dreamed beneath them, how many prayers had been whispered toward their distant light. He thought about the nature of kindness, about how it moved through the world like light through darkness, touching everything it encountered and leaving each thing a little brighter than before. He thought about the people he had known and loved, the ones who had taught him and the ones he had taught, the long chain of connection that linked human hearts across time and space. He thought about Delia, and he hoped she was sleeping well, her worries finally quieted, her mother finally healing, her future finally bright with possibility. He thought about Gerald, wrestling with his demons, trying to find his way toward a better version of himself. He thought about Arthur and Caleb and all the staff at the Lantern House in Bellhaven, this small community of people who had remembered how to be kind. The bus climbed higher into the mountains, and the air grew cooler, and Marcus pulled his worn canvas jacket tighter around his shoulders. He was tired, deeply tired, in the good way that comes from meaningful work well done. It was the tiredness of a farmer after a long day in the fields, the tiredness of a parent after a day spent nurturing and teaching, the tiredness of a life lived in service of something larger than oneself. He let his eyes close finally and let the darkness take him. His last thought before sleep was of his grandmother, standing in the doorway of her small restaurant as the evening light faded, waiting to welcome whoever might come through the door. Her heart as open and warm as the light that spilled out onto the street. "Kindness is worth more than money," she seemed to say. "This is me paying what you're owed." And Marcus, dreaming of her voice and her smile and the warmth of her embrace, felt himself wrapped in something softer than blankets, deeper than sleep, the feeling of being loved, of being known, of being part of something that would endure long after his own small life had run its course. The bus traveled on through the night, carrying its cargo of sleeping souls toward whatever tomorrow would bring. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and silent, watching over all of it with the patient attention of things that have witnessed everything and judged nothing. And somewhere, in a small coastal town by the sea, a lamp burned in the window of a restaurant called the Lantern House, welcoming all who passed, promising warmth and comfort and the simple, revolutionary kindness of being seen. Dawn came slowly in the mountains, first as a lightening of the darkness, then as a flush of color along the eastern horizon, then as the full glory of sunrise breaking over the peaks, and filling the world with gold. The bus had stopped sometime in the night at another small town, and Marcus had woken briefly to see a young man boarding with a guitar case and a hopeful smile, presumably on his way to seek his fortune in the world beyond these mountains. Now, as the sun rose higher and the passengers stirred from sleep, Marcus watched the landscape unfold outside his window and felt ready for whatever the day might bring. His body was rested, his mind was clear, and his heart was full of the quiet joy that came from knowing he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do. The bus descended from the mountains into a wide valley, green and gold with late-season crops, dotted with farmhouses and barns that looked like they had stood there for generations. This was different country than he had seen before. Agricultural, expansive, shaped by the rhythms of planting and harvest, rather than the rhythms of the sea or the mountains. By mid-morning, the bus reached a town called Maplewood. It was a proper small town, larger than Bellhaven, but with the same sense of community, the same feeling that everyone knew everyone and looked out for one another. The streets were lined with maple trees, whose leaves were just beginning to turn, and the light that filtered through them was dappled and golden and utterly beautiful. Marcus stepped off the bus and stretched, breathing in the warm autumn air, looking around at this new place with fresh eyes. He did not know if there was a lantern house here. The chain was large, but it did not cover every town, and for the moment, he did not care. He was simply here, present in this moment, open to whatever it might offer. He found a small bed and breakfast on the edge of town and checked in for a few nights, wanting to rest properly after the long journey. His room was on the second floor, with a window that looked out over an apple orchard and the valley beyond. He unpacked his small bag, washed his face, and lay down on the comfortable bed just for a moment, just to close his eyes. When he woke, it was late afternoon, and the light through the window had turned to honey. He had slept for hours, a deep and dreamless sleep, and he rose feeling refreshed in a way he hadn't felt in weeks. His body was relaxed, his mind was peaceful, and when he looked out the window at the golden light on the apple trees, he felt something. That might have been happiness, pure and simple. He walked into town as evening approached, wandering the streets without destination, stopping to admire the window displays and the autumn decorations that had appeared on every doorstep. He ate dinner at a family restaurant that was not a lantern house, but had much of the same spirit, warm, welcoming, unpretentious in its desire to make people feel at home. The owner, a heavy-set woman with a laugh that seemed to come from somewhere very deep inside her, came to his table to ask how he had enjoyed his meal. Marcus told her, honestly, that it had been wonderful. The meatloaf was as good as his grandmother's, and the apple pie was even better. She beamed at the compliment and brought him a second slice of pie on the house, refusing to take his money for it. "Kindness is worth more than money," she said, and Marcus felt his heart catch in his throat, hearing his grandmother's words in a stranger's voice. That night, back in his room at the bed and breakfast, Marcus sat by the window and watched the stars appear over the orchard. He thought about the woman in the restaurant, about the way kindness rippled outward from person to person, each act inspiring the next, until the whole world was webbed with invisible threads of connection and care. He thought about everything that had happened in Bellhaven, about Delia and Gerald, and the slow, patient work of healing. He thought about the restaurants he had yet to visit, the people he had yet to meet, the challenges he had yet to face, and he felt not dread, but anticipation. Not exhaustion, but eagerness. The eagerness of someone who knew, with perfect certainty, that they had found their purpose in the world. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, following their ancient patterns, and Marcus let his mind drift toward rest. Tomorrow, he would explore more of Maplewood. Tomorrow he might find another lantern house, or he might not. It did not matter. What mattered was being present, being open, being ready to offer kindness wherever it was needed. The waves did not argue with the stone. They simply touched and touched again. And in the touching, both were changed. The days in Maplewood passed gently, one flowing into the next with the easy rhythm of a town that had learned long ago that there was no need to hurry. Marcus walked the streets and talked to the people and let himself simply exist in this pleasant place, soaking up the autumn beauty and the small town warmth like sunlight after a long winter. He did find a lantern house, eventually, a small location on the edge of the commercial district, between a hardware store and a florist. It was newer than the one in Bellhaven, opened just 2 years ago, and when Marcus walked through the door, he was greeted with exactly the kind of warmth he had always intended for his restaurants. The manager, a young woman named Patricia, ran the place with a gentle hand and a warm heart. The staff were happy, the customers were satisfied, and the atmosphere was everything Marcus had dreamed of when he had first envisioned what a lantern house could be. He ate there several times during his stay in Maplewood, sitting in a different section each time, observing the flow of service and the interactions between staff and guests. Everything was as it should be. There was nothing here that needed healing, nothing that required his gentle intervention. And Marcus found that this pleased him just as much as the work he had done in Bellhaven, perhaps more, because for every restaurant that had lost its way, there were many more that had held fast to their purpose. For every Gerald who needed guidance, there were countless Patricias who understood instinctively what hospitality meant and practiced it every day. The world was not as broken as it sometimes seemed. The world was full of people trying their best, doing their part, lighting their own small lamps against the darkness. Marcus was just one more lamp among many, one more person adding his light to the great constellation of human kindness. On his last evening in Maplewood, he walked to the edge of town and sat on a fence rail overlooking the valley. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and purple, and the apple trees in the orchard stood in silhouette against the blazing sky. A cool breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Marcus thought about the journey ahead of him, the roads yet to travel, the towns yet to visit, the people yet to meet. He thought about growing older, about the time when his body would no longer carry him so easily from place to place. He thought about what would happen to his company, his legacy, the vision he had spent his life trying to bring into being. But these thoughts did not trouble him. He had spent too long in the company of fear to let it rule him now. Whatever came, he would meet it with the same gentle spirit he had carried his whole life. He would keep walking, keep planting seeds of kindness, keep touching stone after stone with the patient persistence of the waves. And when his time came, when his journey finally ended, he would rest knowing that he had done his best, that he had loved well, that he had left the world a little gentler than he had found it. The stars came out, one by one, and Marcus let his eyes trace the familiar patterns. He thought of everyone he loved, his grandmother, long gone but never forgotten, Delia, finding her way toward a brighter future, Gerald, learning painfully but bravely to change, Arthur and Ruth and all the countless people who had touched his life and been touched by it. He thought of the travelers on the bus, the strangers in the restaurants, the faces in the streets of every town he had ever visited, each one carrying their own stories, their own struggles, their own hopes and fears, each one worthy of kindness, each one deserving of welcome. The night deepened around him, soft and peaceful, and Marcus finally rose from the fence rail and made his way back toward the bed and breakfast. Tomorrow, he would board another bus and continue his journey. Tomorrow, new roads and new towns and new people awaited. But tonight, he would rest. tonight, he would let the darkness hold him gently like a grandmother's embrace. Tonight, he would sleep and dream and trust that whatever came next would unfold exactly as it was meant to. The waves did not argue with the stone. They simply touched and touched again, and in the touching, both were changed. The seasons turned, as seasons do, and Marcus's journey continued through autumn into winter and from winter into spring. He traveled to cities and small towns, to coastal villages and mountain hamlets, to places he had been before and places he was seeing for the first time. And everywhere he went, he carried with him the same simple message, the same gentle practice, the same patient commitment to making the world a little kinder, one person at a time. He received letters from Bellhaven, regular updates from Delia that arrived wherever he happened to be staying. She told him about the changes at the Lantern House, about the new atmosphere of warmth and welcome that had taken root there. She told him about Gerald, who was still struggling but still trying, who had started volunteering at the local food bank on his days off because he wanted to practice kindness outside of work. She told him about her mother, whose health continued to improve, who had started painting again after years of not being able to hold a brush. She told him that they missed him, that they thought of him often, that the lamp in the window burned a little brighter when they remembered his gentle smile and his patient words. Marcus wrote back, sharing stories from his travels, offering encouragement and wisdom when it was asked for, simply connecting when connection was all that was needed. He had become, without quite intending to, a kind of invisible thread linking together all the people and places he had touched, a network of kindness that spanned the country and drew strength from every node. Spring found him in a small town in New England, where the dogwoods were blooming and the air was soft with the promise of summer. He had been traveling for almost a year now, longer than he had ever been away from home, and he was beginning to feel a pull towards something like rest. Not the rest of stopping, exactly, but the rest of settling, of putting down roots, of letting himself be still for a while. He thought of Bellhaven. He thought of the harbor and the bookshop and the lamp burning in the window of the Lantern House. He thought of Delia's smile and Arthur's kind eyes and even Gerald's earnest struggle toward change. He thought of Ruth in her shop, surrounded by books and seashells, always ready with a cup of tea and a listening ear. And he realized with a quiet certainty that settled over him like a warm blanket that he wanted to go back, not forever perhaps. He was still a traveler at heart, still drawn to the open road and the unknown horizon, but for a while, for a season, for long enough to watch the summer unfold over the harbor and the autumn paint the hills in gold. He booked a bus ticket that same day. The bus pulled into Bellhaven on a soft June evening, and Marcus stepped off into air that smelled of salt and roses and home. The town was just as beautiful as he remembered, perhaps more so. The gardens were in full bloom, the boats rocked gently in the harbor, and the light was that particular golden quality that seemed to exist only in places touched by the sea. Delia was waiting for him at the bus station. She looked different than she had when he had left, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders and replaced with something like joy. Her smile when she saw him was so bright it seemed to illuminate the whole street. "You came back," she said, and there were tears in her eyes. But they were good tears, the kind that came from happiness rather than pain. "I came back," Marcus agreed, embracing her. "I told you I would." They walked together through the town, past the shops and the gardens and the church with its steeple reaching toward the sky. They walked past Ruth's bookshop, where Ruth herself was just closing up for the evening. She waved when she saw them, her face breaking into a delighted smile. They walked past the community garden and the park, and all the small, familiar places that Marcus had come to love during his months here. And finally, they walked to the Lantern House. It looked the same as it had when Marcus had left. The weathered shingles, the white trim, the flower boxes overflowing with summer blooms. But there was something different about it too. Something that Marcus felt more than saw. A warmth that radiated from the windows. A welcome that seemed to extend beyond the door and reach out into the street. The restaurant was full, as it always was in the evenings, and through the large windows, Marcus could see the tables occupied by families and couples and groups of friends. He could see the staff moving through the dining room with purpose and grace, could see the smiles on their faces and the easy way they interacted with each other. And he could see Gerald, standing near the host's stand, greeting a young family with a warmth that would have been unimaginable a year ago. His expression was relaxed, his posture open, and when he saw Marcus through the window, his face broke into a smile of genuine delight. "He's changed," Delia said softly, following Marcus's gaze. "Really changed. It took time and it wasn't easy, but he's not the same person he was. None of us are." Marcus felt his eyes grow wet, and he did not try to hide it. This was what he had spent his life working toward. Not profit or expansion or business success, but this. A place where people could become better versions of themselves. A place where fear was replaced with love. A place where the lamp in the window burned not just for customers, but for everyone who worked within those walls. "Let's go inside," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm home." The summer in Bellhaven unfolded like a gift. Each day a little treasure to be unwrapped and savored. Marcus took a small cottage near the harbor, close enough to smell the salt air and hear the cry of the gulls, close enough to walk to the lantern house whenever the mood struck him. He did not work at the restaurant. His days of managing and supervising were behind him, but he was there often, sitting at his old table by the window, watching the flow of hospitality and marveling at how beautifully it all worked. Sometimes he would talk with the staff, sharing stories and wisdom, offering encouragement when it was needed. Sometimes he would simply sit and observe, letting the warmth of the place wash over him like sunlight. He became a fixture in the town, a familiar face on the harbor path and in the shops along Main Street. Ruth kept a chair reserved for him in her bookshop, and they would sit together for hours, talking about books and life and the nature of kindness. The volunteers in the community garden gave him his own small plot, and he spent peaceful mornings tending tomatoes and beans and basil, feeling the rich earth between his fingers and the sun warm on his back. And in the evenings, when the light turned gold and the stars began to appear, Marcus would walk to his favorite spot on the harbor, the overlook where he had first stood with Delia all those months ago. He would watch the water and the sky, and he would feel something that he had sought his whole life but had rarely let himself fully experience: peace. Not the peace of having finished, of being done, the peace of being present, the peace of knowing that everything was exactly as it should be, that the work he had done mattered, that the kindness he had planted was growing and spreading in ways he would never fully see. He thought often of his grandmother, of her small restaurant and her enormous heart. He thought of the old woman with the coin, the one who had changed his life with a single act of gratitude. He thought of all the people who had touched him and been touched by him, the great web of connection that spread out from this small coastal town and reached across the country, and he felt, with increasing certainty, that his journey was coming to a close. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. The road that had carried him so far was beginning to reach its end, and Marcus found that he was not afraid. He had lived well. He had loved well. He had left the world a little gentler than he had found it. What more could anyone ask? The autumn came, as autumn always comes, painting the hills in shades of gold and amber and red. The tourists who had filled Bellhaven during the summer months began to drift away, leaving the town to its year-round residents its quieter rhythms, its more intimate beauty. Marcus watched the leaves change from his cottage window, feeling the coolness creep into the air, noticing the way the light shifted earlier each evening. He was tired more often now, needing longer rests between his walks to town, finding comfort in the warmth of his small fireplace and the softness of his chair by the window. Delia came to visit him every few days, bringing food from the lantern house and stories from the restaurant. Arthur came too, and Ruth, and even Gerald, who had become something approaching a friend. They would sit together in Marcus's small living room, talking and laughing, sharing the quiet communion of people who had been through something together and come out the other side. On one such evening, as the fire crackled and the wind whispered outside, Delia asked Marcus a question that she had clearly been holding for a long time. What happens to all of this when not now, not anytime soon, but someday? What happens to the lantern house, to everything you've built? Marcus smiled, the gentle smile that had become his signature over his many years. It goes on, he said simply. That's the whole point. It was never about me. It was always about the idea, the belief that kindness is stronger than fear, that hospitality is a form of love, that every person who walks through our doors deserves to feel welcome. Those ideas don't die when I do. They live in you, and in Gerald, and in Arthur, and in every person who has ever been touched by what we're trying to do. They spread and grow and take root in new places, and eventually they become so much bigger than any one person that they can't be stopped. He looked at the fire, watching the flames dance. That's what I've always believed anyway. That's what my grandmother believed. That's what keeps me going, even now. The knowledge that it's not up to me to save the world. It's just up to me to play my part, to plant my seeds, to touch the stones I can reach, and then to trust that others will do the same. Delia was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. You've given us so much. I don't know how to thank you. I don't know if it's possible to thank someone for something like this. You thank me by continuing, Marcus said, by being kind, by welcoming the next person who walks through your door, even if they look like they don't belong, by believing in people even when they haven't given you a reason to. That's the only thanks I've ever wanted. That's the only legacy I've ever sought. Outside, the wind picked up, and the first cold drops of autumn rain began to tap against the windows. Marcus closed his eyes and listened to the sound, feeling it wash over him like a blessing, like a lullaby, like a promise. That everything, all of it, the joy and the sorrow and the endless patient work of loving the world, was exactly as it should be. The winter came gently to Bellhaven, soft and quiet, wrapping the town in white and silver, and the deep blue of short days and long nights. Marcus spent most of his time now in his cottage, wrapped in blankets by the fire, reading the books that Ruth kept bringing him, dozing in the soft light of the afternoon. He was ready. He had been ready for some time now, though he had never spoken of it aloud. There was a peace in him that went beyond contentment, a stillness that felt like the stillness of the sea on a windless day. He had done what he had come to do. He had loved what he had been given to love. He had planted seeds that would bloom long after he was gone. On the night of the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, Marcus dreamed of his grandmother. She was standing in the doorway of her restaurant, just as she always had, with the warm light spilling out behind her, and a smile on her face that seemed to hold all the love in the world. She reached out her hand to him, and he took it, feeling the familiar warmth of her touch, smelling the familiar scent of apple pie and wood smoke. "It's time, my love," she said, and her voice was exactly as he remembered it, gentle, musical, full of the quiet strength of someone who had spent her life in service of others. "You've done so well. I'm so proud of you. "I'm not afraid," Marcus said, and it was true. "I know," his grandmother replied. "You were never meant to be. Fear was never your nature. You were made for kindness. You were made for love." She led him forward, through the door of her restaurant, and into a light that was brighter than any he had ever seen. A light that was warm rather than harsh, embracing rather than exposing. And Marcus walked into it without hesitation, feeling himself dissolve into something larger, something infinite, something that had been waiting for him his whole life. Behind him, in the small coastal town of Bellhaven, the lamp in the window of the lantern house burned on through the longest night, and when the sun rose on the first morning of winter, when the world began its slow turn back toward light, that lamp was still burning, steady and warm and welcoming, a beacon for all who needed shelter from the cold. Marcus Holloway was gone, but what he had built, the kindness, the welcome, the revolutionary act of treating every person as worthy of love, that would endure, that would spread, that would touch stone after stone, heart after heart, until the whole world was changed. The waves did not argue with the stone. They simply touched and touched again. And in the touching, both were changed. In Bellhaven, the Lantern House continues to welcome all who enter. Delia became the manager, leading with the same gentle spirit that Marcus had modeled for her. Gerald found peace as a community, volunteer, using his organizing skills to help those in need. Arthur retired, but still comes in every Sunday to share stories with the customers. And in the window, the lamp burns on, as it has always burned, as it will always burn, a small light against the darkness, a promise that kindness endures. May you rest well tonight, dear listener. May your dreams be gentle. May you wake to a world made a little brighter by the kindness you carry within you. Sleep now. Sleep well. All is well. The end.